All right, so there's this new missile test out of Pakistan that has just been blowing up online. You know how it goes. 1 minute it's a routine military test, and the next everyone's calling it this revolutionary superweapon. So, what is actually going on here? Let's get into it.
And I mean immediately. After the test, social media just went wild. You started seeing these incredibly bold claims popping up everywhere, like this one. People were positioning this new SMS missile as a definitive carrier killer, full stop. The narrative was basically set in stone within hours. Pakistan has a new weapon, and it's about to change the entire naval game.
I mean, those are some dramatic claims, right? But the big question is, do they hold up? Do they actually match the evidence we have? Because, in this age of instant internet hype, the story can get way ahead of the facts. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to peel back the layers here and really try to separate the hype from the reality of the hardware.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at those big claims, the whole superweapon story. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the technology, what it takes to actually hit a moving ship with a missile like this. After that, it's hype versus reality. We'll stack up the claims against what the experts are saying. Then we'll figure out what the real strategic shift is here. And finally, we'll zoom out and see how this all fits into the wider arms race in the region.
Okay, first up, this idea of a new superweapon. Let's really look at the picture that was painted by those first media reports and all the online chatter. The story that got out there was all about a sudden, massive leap in technology for Pakistan.
And the narrative that took hold, well, it was all about a massive breakthrough. People were talking about South Asia's first hypersonic missile. They were throwing around incredible numbers, speeds exceeding Mach 8, that's almost 10,000 kilometers an hour, and a range of 700, maybe even 850 kilometers. The bottom line was, this was a game changer that could sink aircraft carriers, and it was all supposedly 100% Pakistani technology.
Okay, so to figure out what's real and what's just noise, we have to get a handle on the technology itself. That brings us to the challenge of hitting a ship. So let's talk about anti-ship ballistic missiles, or ASBMs. What are they, really?
So an ASBM, it's a whole different beast. Think about it. Hitting a city is one thing. It's not going anywhere. But hitting a warship, that ship is moving, it's turning, it's actively trying to not get hit, and it's hundreds of kilometers out at sea. It is, without a doubt, one of the most difficult targeting problems you can imagine in modern warfare.
And the reason it's so hard is because an ASBM isn't just about the missile, it's about the entire system behind it. You need what the military calls a kill chain. First, you have to find the ship, which is way over the horizon. Then, you have to track it continuously as it moves. And finally, the missile itself needs that terminal guidance, those last-second adjustments to actually hit a target that isn't where it was a minute ago. The missile is really just a final piece of a huge, complicated puzzle.
The idea for this kind of weapon has been floating around since the Soviet era in the 70s, but actually making one work, that's a whole other ballgame. For a long time, it was just theoretical. Then, in the 2010s, China actually did it. They fielded the world's first operational ASBM, the famous DF-21D Carrier Killer. And just recently, in 2023, we saw them used in combat for the very first time by Houthi forces. That really drove home that this technology is no longer just on paper.
All right, so now that we have that background, let's get to the main event. Hype meets reality. Let's really deconstruct those big claims we talked about at the beginning.
And wow, right off the bat, you see a massive difference. The hype was all about a 700 to 850 kilometer range. But when you look at what the analysts are saying, the actual assessment is more like 300 to 350 kilometers. That's less than half. A huge discrepancy.
And then there's that buzzword, hypersonic. This is a big point of confusion. See, a true hypersonic weapon isn't just fast. It can maneuver at those incredible speeds, like Mach 5 plus, inside the atmosphere. The thing is, pretty much all ballistic missiles reach hypersonic speeds as they fall back to Earth. It's just physics. But that doesn't make them a maneuverable hypersonic glide vehicle. And there's simply no evidence that SMS is one of those.
So when you put all the reports side by side, you can see a pretty clear pattern, right? On one hand, you've got news outlets running with these huge, exciting numbers. Over Mach 8, 850 kilometer range. And on the other hand, you have the more technical defense analysis sites giving a much more down-to-earth assessment. Two very different stories.
So, if it's not this revolutionary, brand new design, then where did it come from? That's the obvious question, right?
And the answer seems to be not some top-secret breakthrough, but something we see all the time in the defense world: international cooperation.
And there's actually a great analogy for this. Think of the Swedish Gripen fighter jet. It's a Swedish plane designed in Sweden, but a ton of its key parts, like the engine, come from the US and the UK. The Smash missile is probably a lot like that. It's an original Pakistani design, sure, but analysts have pointed out how similar it looks to the Chinese CM-401 missile. So the thinking is, it's a Pakistani design that heavily relies on Chinese tech to actually work. It's an original design, yes, but not a completely homegrown indigenous system.
Okay, so let's strip away all that hype. What can this missile actually do? What's the real strategic shift here?
So let's work with the number that the analysts keep coming back to: 350 kilometers. Let's just focus on that for a second.
Now, 350 kilometers might not be carrier killer range for a ship way out in the deep ocean, but don't discount it. What it does do is create a powerful defensive bubble off Pakistan's coast. It's what's called anti-access/area denial, or A2/AD. Basically, it makes it very, very risky for an opposing navy to operate close to the Pakistani shoreline. So it's not an offensive superweapon, but it is a pretty potent defensive tool.
All right, finally, let's pull back and look at the bigger picture. Because a weapon like this doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's part of a much wider arms race. And this is really just the latest move in a very long, very tense competition between India and Pakistan. It's an arms race that a lot of countries, especially the United States, are watching incredibly closely, as you can see from this recent report. And what makes all of this even more intense is the nuclear backdrop. India and Pakistan have nearly the same number of nuclear warheads, as you can see from these estimates. When you have that kind of nuclear parity, it actually makes advanced conventional weapons like SMASH even more important, because they change the strategic math for any conflict that stays below that nuclear threshold.
And that really leaves us with one last kind of sobering thought. In this age of instant hype, what happens when the story about a weapon becomes more powerful than the weapon itself? It creates this really dangerous risk of miscalculation. If a crisis ever does flare up and leaders are acting based on the online hype instead of the cold, hard reality, well, that's how you stumble into a much bigger conflict. And that, maybe, is the biggest danger of all.